Should tell me in a minute if we're recording. All right.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Elliott from LSE to this, what I believe is going to be the capstone of the spring semester special seminar series in geographies of risk. And it's an exciting, it's an exciting thing to have her joining us today because, among other things, she has recently published this. So she's the author of a new book called Underwater. Title is Loss, Flood Insurance, and the Moral Economy of Climate Change in the United States. And we got a chance to have a conversation that went up as part of the Geographies of Risk podcast. It was fantastic. Well, I certainly, I loved it. It was great to talk with you. And it's such a pleasure to have you here today for this seminar series to talk about your work. And over to you.
Thanks very much, Eli. Thanks so much for this invitation. I mean, to join you today, but also to be part of the Geographies at Risk podcast, which I think has been such a gift. It was a wonderful and really generative conversation, but then also being able to listen to some of the other episodes and kind of get a view into the work and the minds of people who have a lot of the same shared interests, people whose work I've read but haven't had a chance to meet personally. It's been a real treat. So thank you to you for organizing that. So this is a presentation that will actually present part of the book in a bit more detail, but I'll also give you a kind of general overview. And the title of the talk is the title of a chapter of the book called Losing Ground. So I want to start today by pointing our attention to a story that came out in the New York Times just a month ago. Chuck Schumer stalls climate overhaul of flood insurance program. So what happened here is that the Senate leader in the US Congress, Chuck Schumer, got wind of a plan inside the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to change the way that the US National Flood Insurance Program sets the price of flood insurance. So if you've been attending these series, you know a bit about the NFIP, the flood insurance program already from Anna Weber, who did a fantastic seminar on it. But in case you did not see that or you've never heard of the NFIP, this is a public federal program that underwrites flood insurance for most homes and small businesses across the United States. And its new approach to setting the price of insurance would mean that policyholders would be paying rates more in line with an assessment of their quote unquote individual flood risk, determined on the basis of their distance to a flooding source, the particular features of their homes, and for the first time on the basis of catastrophe modeling of the kind that private insurers have already been using for a long time. So for about 80% of the people living in floodplains, this could amount to large, though gradually realized, kind of phased in increases to their yearly insurance premiums, which could also negatively affect their property values because, a house that is kind of regarded as newly or more intensely risky and more expensive to insure is in some ways a less appealing purchase or investment. So I want to make an observation about this news story to set the stage for the discussion today. And that observation is that this is indeed framed as a climate change story. If climate change is intensifying flood risks, which we believe it is, then there are two ideas that tend to follow for many observers, commentators, and researchers. And the first is that insurance arrangements need to adapt. They need to charge more, they need to enroll more policyholders in order to bring in more money to compensate for higher expected losses. So there's a kind of math problem that needs to be solved. And the second observation is that insurance is going to be part of how people and communities themselves adapt. So the idea here is that insurance pricing, if it's properly executed, signals risk to individual and collective decision makers, which allows them to make a rational calculation of the costs and benefits of building or rebuilding in a particular place. So the idea is that we need to price insurance according to risk in order to incentivize prudent action in the face of climate change. So there's a kind of human behavior problem that needs to be solved, which turns on a particular economistic way of thinking about how information about risk and its price shapes or should shape action. So it's that second idea, that human behavior problem, that I want to explore with you today. And I'm going to do that by sharing with you some of the material from my recently published book, Underwater. And I'll focus in particular on the material in chapter 2, which takes an up-close look at what happened in New York City in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, as people there came to grips with updated maps of the city's flood risk and a new set of rules around setting the price of insurance. So not this most recent effort to change the way that the program prices insurance, but a previous one. But first, what do you need to know about the NFIP? Why did I write a book about it? What's interesting about it? And again, fortunately, I don't have to spend too much time on this because you've seen Anna Weber here. But briefly, and particularly relevant to our discussion today, the NFIP is actually a very old program. So though today it features in a lot of policy conversations about climate change, it was established by the US Congress long before climate change was an object of concern back in the 1960s, when at the time private insurers could not be convinced to sell flood insurance on their own. So again, this is a public federal program. It provides about $1.3 trillion in insurance coverage in over 22,000 communities across the US. It's currently run by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is responsible for mapping the nation's flood zones and also for setting the price paid for a federal flood insurance policy. And it's also a hugely beleaguered program. So it's been billions of dollars in debt to the US Treasury since Hurricane Katrina. It's largely failed to prevent continued building and rebuilding in harm's way, which was a big part of its founding rationale. And it's also forged unexpected alliances. Democrats with Republicans, conservatives with environmentalists, homeowners at risk with the very building and real estate interests who could be blamed for putting them there. So that's why it is and why, so that's what it is and why I think it's kind of substantively interesting. But analytically, I think the way into some of the larger questions we might have about the politics of climate change starts from specific practices and knowledge infrastructures. So more specifically, for my purposes, this means that economizing institutions like the NFIP, by which I mean institutions that take physical features of a landscape or changes to those physical features and act on them so that they can be rendered into dollars and cents. These kinds of economizing institutions provide a useful terrain for witnessing how social actors work out, in however tentative or however provisional a fashion, a bunch of different dilemmas. These are dilemmas related to threats to public finances, private profit making in real estate development, threats to coastal and riverine ecologies, housing markets, and ways of life. So the upshot of studying some of the specific practices and knowledge infrastructures of an institution like the NFIP is that insurance is a terrain upon which people fight about loss. And you may be thinking, well, of course, insurance is about loss. Insurance is the institution we use to manage loss. You pay premiums to secure compensation in the face of potential loss. But here in the book, I examine and I think about loss in a more capacious sense than the one that is endemic to insurance, because there are losses at stake here that are not only financial, but also social and emotional. Losses that can't be compensated with money, and so instead are resisted or mourned. And what's relevant to people as they confront loss in this fuller sense are questions about what is fair and valuable, what needs protecting and what should be let go, who deserves assistance and on what terms, and whose vision of the future should be used to govern the present. So there are no answers to those questions, but there are settlements. And those settlements have huge social and material implications, because reforming flood insurance involves a negotiation about who can live where, for how long, and on what terms. So as I studied some of the historical and contemporary conflicts around the NFIP, the various actors that I encountered in this story could not talk about what was wrong with the NFIP or what needed to be made right, without also talking about what is fair, prudent, just, deserved, or equitable. claims about flood maps, risk classifications, and the price of premiums, even when couched in a language of scientific accuracy, as they typically are, also always draw upon a backdrop of normative commitments about what states, markets, and individuals can or ought to do. So I wrote the book about flood insurance because I ultimately came to see the NFIP as an opportunity to think through the moral economy of climate change in the United States. So by this, I mean, of course, it's a useful site for witnessing the entanglements of moral ideas and claims with the economic arrangements that govern people's lives. But in a broader sense, the NFIP participates in shaping the kind of problem that climate change is considered to be in the US, as well as who is responsible for addressing it and how. So I argue in the book that from the NFIP, we can appreciate that some of the thorniest challenges when it comes to the problem of loss are unsettled and unsettling questions of responsibility for loss, justification of loss, and compensation for loss. So by way of just kind of briefly giving you a bit more context about what went into the book, the project started as my PhD dissertation at UC Berkeley in 2013. So I've been thinking about this program for a long time. The book combines a variety of different types of qualitative data, so ethnographic observation, interviews, archival materials, and other relevant documents. The data collection started in New York City after Hurricane Sandy, where controversies over the latest NFIP reform first became lively, but I followed the story ethnographically into New Jersey and down to Washington, D.C. So I turned up at the sites where flood insurance was discussed, interpreted, and debated. These were sites like community town halls, meetings of architects and housing advisors, Hurricane Sandy vigils, state assembly listening sessions, committee meetings of the National Academy of Sciences. And I tried to get as many angles of view on the NFIP as possible. So I interviewed not only policyholders, some of whom became activists, but also environmentalists, federal and city officials, elected politicians, floodplain engineers, risk modelers, lawyers, insurance professionals, and others. I also read and analyzed congressional transcripts and reports and other relevant documents from the 1950s through the present. So the general approach was to understand flood insurance as an institution that people have different ideas about and that frame social action in interesting ways, but also as an experience that involves complex and conflicted decision-making, and that's really what I'll spend more time on today. The book also includes a chapter that kind of looks ahead, a chapter called Floodplain Futures, which outlines 4 different trajectories that we're beginning to see unfold in different places. And it examines the role that insurance does or might play in each of them, each of those trajectories. So this qualitative and historically socially structured, socially situated approach to studying insurance is typical of critical social science scholarship on insurance, but it's not terribly typical in studies of the NFIP, where economists, risk scientists, and public policy folks have been able to kind of give us the view from 30,000 feet, but haven't really taken us up close. Okay, so for the rest of my time here, I'd like to share in a bit more detail some of that ethnographic and interview data that gave me this socially situated view of the NFIP. So the story begins here. Around the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, which laid waste to the greater New York City area in October 2012, the city's comptroller released a report that calculated that the city had over $129 billion of property value at risk of flooding. This calculation was made possible on the basis of maps of the city's flood zones, which put boundaries around the parts of the city that were at high risk of flooding. So one could then pretty straightforwardly tally up the property value inside those zones. And after Sandy, the city got new flood maps, which showed that the official flood zones had expanded relative to the old maps. The property value at risk of flooding had increased as a result, 120% over the previous maps. So in his report, the comptroller concluded that this new and more troubling picture of value at risk should motivate spending today that would help the city's residents to adapt to a frightfully watery future. The report reads, "With such immense value arrayed along the city's coast, we must act now to make the necessary investments to protect our homes, our businesses, and our neighborhoods from the future effects of climate change. While the costs of resiliency projects are high, investing in the city's future will pay enormous dividends, both to our waterfront communities and our broader economy." So there's a lot of sense to this, right? I mean, maps like these, maps that visualize information about value and risk, are meant to empower actors to take informed, more confident decisions about where or how to build or live. Government actors like the comptroller can use calculations of risk and economic value to inform and justify certain kinds of investments, as well as things like zoning regulations and building codes. But another key part of this story is that these aren't just maps of flood risk. They're what's called flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, which means these maps form the technical basis for pricing insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. So new maps were not just a signal of changing risks to the city as a whole. They were also tied to the price that individual households would pay for flood insurance. More homes at worse risk meant more people paying more money for flood insurance. So at the individual level too, then, these maps and the insurance premiums they make possible are meant to motivate informed and economically rational action that lowers your risk and thereby lowers the price that you pay for flood insurance. So what this graphic from FEMA is showing is this expectation that information about property value and risk helps an individual policyholder to see that if they elevate their home above the height of the expected floodwaters, they can save money on insurance premiums, and they will also be less likely to suffer a disruptive flood loss. So we might expect such information to be especially impactful in a place like New York City in the wake of a historic storm and flood. And, here I want to kind of think back to the behavioral problem as it relates to climate change adaptation that I mentioned at the start. So when people talk about flood insurance in the context of climate change, they often are talking about this idea that we can use this economic tool to secure a kind of gradual transformation of the landscape that will be better adapted to floods. So people kind of calculating rationally in the aggregate means that houses will be higher up, they'll be above the rising waters, or it will encourage people to move on. If it's too risky and it's too expensive to live there, they'll get out of harm's way. And so we'll gradually nudge people higher up or further away from the water. And that's one important way that we will adapt people and cities, communities to the effects of climate change. So this is a very elegant logic on paper, or if we take the view from 30,000 feet. But if we view this from the streets of New York City, as I did, to see how this new landscape of value at risk was grafted onto the physical and social realities of this place at this time, a very interesting picture emerges. So first, the outcome was really uneven. Some people mitigated their flood risk by elevating their homes or relocating. So the map worked the way it was kind of supposed to. But even still, they protested the maps, they protested the increases in flood insurance rates, rallying in the streets against this and organizing their neighbors and calling their elected politicians. Some people refused to elevate their homes, which is expensive to do, even when funding was made available from the city. Some people decided to wait and see what happened next with the maps, with flood insurance, with floods. So a behavioral economist or a cognitive psychologist might attribute these outcomes to individual cognitive deficiencies in understanding and making rational decisions based on objective calculations of risk. Maybe some of these people are more sophisticated market actors than others. Or maybe this simply reflects that we are bad at understanding probabilities. We tend to think bad things won't happen to us. If they do happen, we tend to think they won't be that bad. And if they are bad, we tend to think we'll be able to bounce back. But Sandy had just happened, and people seemed to understand that the flood risk facing them in New York City was serious and getting worse. And this is actually backed up by survey data. 86% of people in the flood zones acknowledged that they faced high flood risk. So as a sociologist, I was instead attuned to what might be going on, not in individual atomized heads processing risk information, but what might be going on in neighborhoods and communities. So the meaning that people gave to this map and to new insurance prices was made collectively, and it reflected some of the shared effects that the maps would have for waterfront communities. So what I found was that rather than taking up this new map and feeling more empowered, informed, and confident in making individual risk decisions, for many New Yorkers, the map was scarier than another storm, in the words of one man from Rockaway, Queens. So what could make a flood map scarier than another storm? What made the map scarier than another storm was the ways that for New Yorkers, it didn't simply depict one kind of value, property value, at risk of one kind of harm, flooding. The map actually exposed and intensified multiple risks, unfolding along multiple timelines, as well as seemed to threaten, rather than protect, multiple forms of value. And that led people to protest the maps and the changes to rate setting in the NFIP, even when they took steps to mitigate their own exposure to risk. So let's talk more about the multiple risks that are relevant to how people make decisions in this context. And it's important to note here that these are risks that are not only revealed through engaging with the maps, they're risks that to some people seem to be caused by the maps. So the first is economic risks. Having to do with the kind of economic strain that comes from even responding rationally to the imperative to adapt. So Trish, who lives in Broad Channel, Queens, is someone who sought to mitigate her personal exposure to flood risk through home elevation, but she ran out of money for the job. She couldn't get a second mortgage to finance its completion, leaving her family kind of indefinitely physically and economically insecure. Following through on mitigation, realizing its rewards, is a protracted process, which can introduce economic strain for unknown stretches of time. So Trish says, I do things to protect myself. We're struggling now. Going into debt at 52 years old is not where I wanted to be. So these economic difficulties can lead to experiences of moral struggle as they challenge the stories that people have about their own honor and self-worth. This challenges the story that Trish has about being a kind of grown-up who doesn't have to take on debt. But it's not just immediate economic costs that are related to mitigation. It's also about kind of longer-term expectations that people have for their economic lives and those of their families. So this is a quotation from a flood insurance help desk. These were events that I observed ethnographically. They were convened by the Center for New York City Neighborhoods and other local organizations. The idea was that people dealing with all kinds of issues after Sandy, including flood insurance, could come and kind of get counseled about what to do next. And so in talking to a housing counselor, this woman says through tears, a lot of my neighbors, they're going. What if we want to walk away? No one wants to come down the block to see our house. So because of the change to the risk maps and what they imply for her house, because of the expectation of much higher flood insurance premiums in the future, her property values have taken a hit. Her house is not looking like a compelling asset to be purchased by someone else. And this throws into confusion all of the expectations she had about her house as a store of value, one that might help her kind of plan for her own retirement or pass wealth along to her children. New Yorkers also understood themselves to be at risk of further political developments related to flood insurance, which had in the past and could again at an unknown point in the future lead to unpredictable changes to their own maps or to the program more generally. And that could change the situation on the ground, even if there was never another flood. So all insurance systems, public or private, are politically determined in some way, but the NFIP as a public and federal program has been especially conspicuously shaped by shifting political priorities, funding commitments, and reform agendas. So whenever the NFIP is reauthorized by Congress, which is meant to happen every 5 years, changes to regulatory arrangements for managing flood loss can set off further local changes to land use, to building codes, to zoning regulations, and so forth. So Sophia's house in Broad Channel was completely destroyed in Hurricane Sandy, and she planned to rebuild at higher elevation. However, if the federal government can come in and say, okay, you built a code in 2014, but now it's 2025 and you're no longer up to code, then what? They're going to keep changing the rules of the game midway. So Sophia knew those rules could change further. They could change back at the next NFIP reauthorization map update or sooner. At a flood insurance help desk in Staten Island, a housing counselor described the situation to me this way. We know flood insurance is going to go up. The question is it 15%? Is it 18%? Is it 25%? What are people to do? They're facing flood insurance rate increases very, very quickly, and most people in this community are on the margins of being able to pay their mortgage. Homeowners have an enormous amount of distrust in government, and the government hasn't helped their case any with all the promises and broken promises and when things are going to happen. So based on the consultations he had done, he said, I wouldn't say people flat out don't want to elevate. Instead, they seem to want to wait and see if the changes to the map and insurance rates would stick. And as we saw, the comptroller's report confidently connected the new depiction of flood risk to climate change and to climate change adaptation that would protect the financial value at risk in the city. But for people on the ground, the new map and insurance prices were an ambiguous and politically contentious signal of how near or far climate change might in fact be. So New Yorkers debated whether the map was indeed reflecting local effects of climate change. Dave from Rockaway described the new map as a, quote, fantastic exhibit A for climate change. I think that just from the changing, the amount of homes in flood zones has at least doubled. And that tells you something. And that's not out of preparedness. It's a reaction to what happened. I think it's a very real thing now. And I think that people here are very keenly aware of that. Everybody, all the people that are educated are saying that. So I think that's very real. And I think that the hotter summers and all that sort of thing, I think that's very real. But at the same time, it was hard to know how to assimilate that expectation into a set of decisions. So Amy is an insurance consumer advocate. Her organization advises policyholders in the wake of disasters. She said she knew, quote, rising waters are going to wipe things out. Yet she said she had trouble figuring out, quote, where should my organization be? I figured out early on there was a bit of a schizophrenic problem here. Like I could be lockstep with my environmental colleagues in saying, don't allow new construction, don't allow new construction. But how do you say to someone who's been living, the firefighter, how do you say to them, I'm sorry? But see, you can hear how my focus keeps coming back to wanting people to be able to have insurance, which is not a radical. The radical thing is don't let them live there. And I can't be there because my constituency is the people who are just trying to live their lives. And they don't know from rising sea levels. They just know I've got to drive my kid to school. I've got to get to work, you know. So Amy feels conflicted as to whether she should interpret the new map as grounds for urging homeowners, even if they can make it work financially today, to move out of harm's way, given a potentially riskier and more expensive future. So though the city and state governments connected the new map and insurance premiums to rising sea levels and climate change, map users on the ground grappled with how or whether to factor climate change into planning for next month's mortgage payments, next year's insurance renewal, or the next property sale. And so in other studies of what are sometimes called risk biographies by John Tullock and Deborah Lupton, they've observed that people grapple with this kind of not yet, no longer temporality in the context of their own lives. And in this case, that's an ambiguous temporality that's connected to the flood map. So the city is not yet facing sea level rise that makes its waterfront entirely physically or financially uninhabitable, at least if you can afford to rebuild and insure. But at the same time, the changing picture of risk on the map suggested that some of the city's waterfront communities were no longer as safe or economically viable as they once were for many of the residents who had long occupied them. Okay, so let's talk about the plural forms of value that are relevant here. So as a technical tool, the maps, in a sense, treat everyone equally. Everyone is subjected to the same processes of risk assessment and economization. But as risks and costs increase, of course, people vary tremendously in their ability to absorb that. And though we think of New York City as an affluent and glamorous global city, which of course it is in many respects, the people who were most affected by the maps at the city's watery edges were not affluent elites. So Dan from Broad Channel, Queens describes his neighborhood this way. This is working class families. The people who live here are the people who pick up your garbage, they teach your kids, they keep you safe from criminals, and they run into burning buildings. That's who lives here. So these are the parts of the city where it's still been possible for working and middle class people to buy single family homes. And so what you should be imagining here in terms of the kind of built environment is not really the dense skyscrapers of Manhattan, but really a more kind of suburban look and feel. I mean, a man in Rockaway joked to me that he moved to Rockaway for the parking. So there's a little bit more space here. And a lot of these communities, people have lived there for generations. So this insurance logic works really well if you can afford to undertake a home elevation project, but a lot of these people couldn't. Or to afford it, they'd have to raid their kids' college fund or spend all the money they saved for retirement or go into debt like Trish. So they're relatively privileged in the sense that they own property, which not everyone does and can, but they're not so flush with cash that undertaking a project like this is a trivial expense. And flood insurance is mandatory for those who live in a high-risk flood zone and have a mortgage, which many people do. So if the new maps result in your insurance rates being recalculated to cost $9,500 per year, that could very well put you in danger of not being able to retain your policy and not being able to pay your mortgage. So for people like that, there was another economically rational course of action: to leave. So what the maps forced these communities to confront then was an uneven transformation of neighborhoods where some would be priced out. And in this way, the maps seem to transgress values in the sense of beliefs that people share about what is important in the world. And in this case, these were values of fairness and equity. So this is a quote from Grace, who's a construction manager in Broad Channel, Queens. They would take this entire community, level it, and sell it to the 1%, the 2% of the population that make a hell of a lot more money than I could ever dream of. They'd put up houses here or condos, sell them at $2 or $3 million a piece. But meanwhile, the regular Joe Schmoes out there, they're making $50,000 a year. Are they going to turn around and say that the Hamptons, we're not talking $1 million homes, we're talking multi-million-dollar homes. They're phenomenal out there, swimming pools and everything else. Are they going to tell them that they can't rebuild their neighborhood? I sincerely, with my heart of hearts, do not believe that. So Grace wonders, in effect, why is it acceptable or even desirable for her to face the loss of her home for the sake of adaptation when more privileged people would not? Class inequalities mean that the burdens of risk exposure visualized on the map and adaptation incentivized through assessing the value at risk will be unequally felt. And these distributional effects on more versus less affluent places undermined the legitimacy of the map's ostensible purpose of helping to protect people and places from facing future loss. But these places are dangerous and expensive, you might be thinking. Well, for their residents, they may be risky if we're thinking only about flood risk, or worthless only if we're thinking about property values and home finance. But they had other kinds of value that people cherished. So this was the first part of that quote from Dan that I showed you earlier. But here's what he went on to say. There's a sense of community down here that's existed since the 20s. And after the storm, this town had the first resource center up. 2 nights after the storm, we have a sense of community that I think is very strong and something that is admirable and something that the country's always sought to support. When I asked if he would move away because it's getting riskier and more expensive, he said, "You're wasting your breath. We're never going to move away." And what I think these threatened values of fairness and equity, of social and emotional worth, as well as the multiple kinds of risks that were shaping how people thought about the past, present, and future, this is what is giving rise to what amounted to a kind of collective rejection of what new maps and higher insurance premiums were perceived to be doing in waterfront communities. So homeowners weren't necessarily saying we don't want to be safe from flood risk or we don't want to save money on our insurance. They were saying that there's more here that needs protecting. There's more here that we value, and the maps and insurance premiums aren't an effective tool for protecting those things. So what does this story give us some leverage on? I think first we can observe that the unavoidable presence and interaction of multiple forms of value complicates the question of what to do and when. And so behavior that might look irrational on its face might just be oriented towards trying to protect other things that matter, the social and emotional value of a place, the sense of honor and kind of moral worth of a person, trying to make a decision about what's best for their family. So even when people do take steps that look economically rational, they may not in fact feel that they are safer, more secure, or better off as a result. The rationality that people experience is not empowering and confidence building in the way perhaps implied by the comptroller's report, but it's instead coercive. It comes to them objectified in technologies and practices that they don't have any control over. So all of this, I think, helps to explain how a map indeed becomes scarier than another storm, and why people might ignore, reject, or resist economic tools and incentives that will purportedly help to make them more resilient. So if we return to where we started, because of some of the dilemmas and controversies that were created the last time the NFIP tried to raise rates, FEMA is actually proceeding pretty carefully here. It's tried to incorporate into this new rating strategy some accounting for inequality by including information about the home value in the algorithm so that the price you pay is more sensitive to what you have and what you can afford. But it still relies on this quite simplified idea about the kinds of calculations that people make when they're confronted with a risk classification and an insurance premium. So if these changes go through, and it's not necessarily clear that they will, I think we should expect the recurrence of some of these familiar social dynamics. And what that suggests to me is that when it comes to climate adaptation, we need approaches that recognize the conflictual, conflicted, and contradictory nature of risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to hear it played out that way. Always, always, always. We have time for questions. I certainly have some, so I will keep mum and leave space for others, but I will step in if there's radio silence. So if you'd like to ask a question, please, you can just pop your hand up and I'll sort of moderate from there, but questions for Dr. Elliott. All right, I'll start, and then that'll warm things up, maybe. It's really interesting to hear the people you were speaking to raise the Hamptons comparison, or what sort of came back to me again in hearing your description in this case was the like the political stomach that it takes to prevent development of a cleared, like watching a working class neighborhood get raised, R-A-Z, ED, get sort of plowed aside for ostensibly, the actions taken for adaptation measures, but then to come back a year or two later and see it all fenced off and construction equipment around and seeing condos go up, to prevent that. Just that sort of bait and switch. If you live there a long time, then what's your sense of sort of the vulnerability of that really coming true in a lot of these neighborhoods that you were walking around in a few years ago?
Yeah. So what's happened, I think New York City is actually a kind of useful natural experiment in some ways, because you have kind of two very different things happening in different parts of the city that give really good insight into some of how these processes play out and how they can kind of be made more or less humane for the residents. And so, on Staten Island, there was a state organized and offered buyout program. And the terms of that buyout were such that the entire community had to kind of organize to agree to do it together, kind of organize for their own dispersal, because it doesn't make sense to have a kind of jack-o'-lantern, pattern of buyouts. And the state buyout promised that land would be returned to wetland. That's what a lot of Staten Island is drained wetland. And the residents would be given pre-storm value of their homes, plus a bonus if they resettled within the borough. So it allows people to kind of to feel whole in multiple senses of the word, both in terms of the kind of financial value they get that kind of reflects what they thought they were going to get when they sold their house before the storm, even if there was nothing left of the house. But also in a kind of broader sense, because people don't have to leave New York City, which is an expensive city to live in, even in the outer boroughs. And so that process worked really well. And, here, everything I know about it, I've learned from the ethnographer, Liz Kozlov, who studied this process in depth. In the rest of the city, in the other boroughs, there was a buyout, but it was organized and offered by the city rather than the state. And the terms of the city buyout were, if you decide it's too risky, it's too expensive to live here, we'll buy your house. We'll even give you pre-storm value, but we reserve the right to redevelop the land. So it won't be returned to nature. And this ended up really mattering to people. I mean, the folks on Staten Island felt like they were taking on this noble sacrifice for their forgotten borough, making sure that everyone else who lived on Staten Island would be safer from the storms to come. People who were offered the city buyout couldn't come away with that sense of kind of moral restoration, moral integrity by making the decision. And indeed, what we've seen is that the city has authorized building in some of the high-risk flood zones. There are huge kind of condo towers going up. The starting price of those condos is $700,000. There's no right of return for the residents who used to live in those parts of the city. And we don't know where they went next. We don't know if they stayed in the borough or if they left entirely. So I think, we can learn something from kind of watching these processes unfold in terms of how people fare differently depending on how these programs are structured. There's a way, I think the Staten Island version gives you the more kind of holistic, realization of resilience that people who think about resilience are interested in than the version that prevailed in other parts of the city, where it was really just a way to kind of continue the turnover, the kind of circulation of capital through real estate, and the continued development of risky areas.
Questions from the floor before I ask another one? All right, well, I'll ask another one, maybe just sort of, then what's your sense of and it's something I think about in, where I live, and I've encountered it in sort of planning literature out there about, the difference in code or the requirements of sort of like, well, my sense of a lot of beach properties is that depending on like the sort of the exceptions that are applied to, I don't know, additions or renovations or things like that, depending on sort of where you are on the East Coast in particular, East and Gulf Coast, sort of how old your house is, like whether you basically get ushered into planning allowances based on, the pre-existing footprint of your home, something like that. And in some places, those requirements are quite strict, and in other places, like the sort of the exceptions that can get applied are sort of head scratching. And so, what was your sense of how those sorts of code updates, code shifts, certainly apply to new builds, but like what about all of these adaptation measures for, so here we are talking about this in the context of the UK, like, if you're a listed property, and US has its own versions of these things, but if you're a historically listed property, the rules are very strict, but like, what do you do when those codes change on you?
Yeah. I mean, in New York City, what they ended up doing was like, if your house was knocked down by Sandy and you're doing, I think it was like a 51%, rebuild. The question of like, how do you adjudicate that, I think is a murky one, but they were saying, you not only have to be up to code with FEMA, you have to be 2 feet higher. So, so I think, I mean, in some ways, that's emblematic of the entire approach to kind of building codes and land use as it relates to disasters and as it relates to climate change, is that we're always kind of fighting the last war. We're saying, well, we're reacting to what just happened. So we use the disaster as an opportunity to adjust the building code when maybe if we'd done a little bit more kind of forward planning and forward zoning, we wouldn't be in that situation. And I think, the other thing about, you made this observation that codes are kind of more or less strict. It's also the case that people are kind of better or worse at getting around them. You can appeal these flood maps. There's been kind of investigative reporting. There's a PhD student at Oregon who's looking at appeals in more detail. If you have resources, you can kind of find ways to move a corner of your building out of the high-risk flood zone, or get the elevation adjusted, to kind of engage in these sort of performative fictions of codes and maps that allow you to kind of live and build the way that you want, and not necessarily the way that the rules suggest you should have to.
The example that I think about a lot also is, and this is a difference in resources, is that, you can picture a very, very old lake property where, back in the day, they were basically like, they're sort of these matchstick cottages. And then that lakeside property gets, very high value associated with it. And, so there are things like, how much standing tree you're supposed to leave between the house and lake. And, I remember, there was a huge property that went in, and, the owner just paid the fine. Like, he cut down everything straight to the water. And like the punitive measure, the penalty is not enough to dissuade. Like, it would dissuade somebody who is, who's trying to, it would dissuade somebody in sort of working class situation. It would not dissuade somebody who can afford, they don't care. And I guess the last question for this, and it's connected. I was just wondering if you encountered in your discussions with people, did you talk with them about sort of were you hearing in the background sort of echoes of the safe development paradox? Like, was this connected to, well, won't the maps change with changes in flood control structures or hazard measures, which then well, now it's safe, and now we can build, now we can grant the permit to this massive condo complex because we just raised the barriers by whatever, couple of feet.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of, in the book I talk about this as a kind of subset of the sort of political risks that people are like, well, okay, the maps are updated, but they're also updated to show if like levees are up to grade, or, all of these other things. So like, is the city going to make those investments? When are they going to make those investments? Can I kind of ride it out until those investments are realized, or am I not going to be able to? Am I going to have to move, and then a year later, everything changes and I could have stayed? That absolutely kind of contributes to the uncertainty that people are trying to navigate. And here, of course, you also see the divergences between different types of places. I mean, New York City, there's a lot of inequality within it, but as a city, I mean, it raises immense revenues, and there's kind of broader cultural and emotional value attached. Like, people want New York City to continue to exist. So Hurricane Sandy was a kind of like nationally poignant event, maybe globally poignant. So, they can marshal the resources to kind of armor themselves, and residents would be kind of reasonable to assume that will take place. And indeed, like a place like Broad Channel, which is not that many people in the scheme of New York City's population, and is tiny, the city spent millions and millions of dollars to elevate the whole thing. I mean, to put all of the streets at higher elevation. So absolutely, I mean, that's going on here. But in places that don't have that kind of aggregate wealth to spend, or places that aren't able to call upon federal resources to protect them, those places, they can't make they can't have those expectations. And we will see the kind of fates of different types of places diverge along those lines, I think. And there, there's something else I was going to say based on the first thing you were talking about that now I've forgotten. but yeah, maybe it'll come back to me.
Was either the paying the penalty for.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that I think is a little bit, that's kind of at the heart of the whole problem here is that the flood insurance program is structured such that everyone ostensibly is responsible for their personal exposure to flood risk, which implies that A, individuals are the source of risk, and B, that individuals can meaningfully control their risk. And of course, we know that flood risk is a collectively produced problem. No one, a lot of the things that put someone at risk of flooding are decisions that transcend what they have control over and predate, either the house was built and a road was built to take you there, right? Those are things that no individual homeowner has control over. And, similarly, the decisions about how to mitigate risk are left to the individual. So, you also have these kind of situations where someone does decide to kind of put their house on stilts, but then if a hurricane comes and blows it over, it's, creating problems for people who did not put their house on stilts. And there's this kind of private-public issue at the heart of this. That's true of kind of America more broadly. And this is something that Colin Geralmack has a new book about fracking. And the kind of central dilemma of that book is this public-private paradox, that people can make private choices about their property that have public consequences that overflow that property.
Fascinating. That's a great place to leave it, actually, with this. That is, what an exit. So we're at time. I want to thank you so much for your time and the contribution to both the podcast and this seminar series. I wish you all the best with your continuing virtual book tour and eventually an in-person book tour, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, and look forward to all the work that is yet to come.
Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Cheers. Many thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.